Texas has just passed what's called HB33, House Bill 33. And I know Amy and Chris have read up on it. As we mentioned before, Hollywood Chris did a thing for the Austin News, CBS affiliate there on this.
And so the bill, I think Chris probably can describe it better than I can given his study, but it was generally a bill looking at after, and they do this sometimes in different states, after a major incident or something that's occurred, they use that as a springboard to try to create some legislation.
Probably should note also that it hasn't actually passed fully yet. It's
Yep,
not
yep.
been signed into law. It's made it through the House. It's now
Well,
moving over to the Senate. Is that right, Chris? Or did
yeah,
I?
it unanimously passed in the House and is moved to the Senate now. We would be remiss to not put who the senator that the congressperson that put this forward was the former mayor of Uvalde. This was his platform to run. That's what he won on. It's called HB33, commonly known as the Uvalde Strong Act, and it is specifically catered towards the police response to an active shooter event. So because he believed that the response to stopping the threat was inaccurate, it was lacking to say the least. It was 77 minutes from the time it was reported to the time it was stopped, and police were on scene 3 minutes after it was reported. So he felt that the police response needed to be better and the police training needed to be better.
Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, over 300 police responded. Is that the number you've seen?
I
We're
didn't
on
see the
site.
exact number, but I know. So there was within 3 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, there was 11 on scene.
Yeah,
So there was
300 seems.
there was federal, there was border patrol, there was sheriff, there was constables, there was all kinds of people that eventually that took over from the Unified School District's police chief and actually was the one who stopped the threat. So
A lot of bipartisan support for this bill, from what I could tell. It looks like a lot of people signed on.
yeah, if it was unanimous, yeah, that was 100% bipartisan.
Does it anticipate passing in the Senate? I would
Yes.
assume it sounds like it will. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's been any pushback whatsoever from what I've read on this.
Tell me more about the police response, because I remember the headlines were not good. And I've seen videos of basically, again, Chris, you or Hollywood, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember seeing some videos come out, especially a few days later, of people like officers hunkered down in a hallway, just kind of checking their phones. And they may not have been doing that for any other purpose than getting some intel, but it did not look good. What was the response from your take? And then I would love to hear more about the bill and what they're trying to fix.
Because you guys gave me a data prep, I read the executive summary on the after action report. And once again, it was 77 minutes, which is a very long time to stop a threat. The Unified School District's police chief treated it as a barricaded situation instead of an active shooter. He felt that it was safer to get the other adjoining classrooms to evacuate to save their lives versus stopping a threat in the classroom that was there. There was multiple, probably dozens of different police agencies that showed up on scene, and there was no unified command. There was no individual person that took charge. He was in the school trying to make decisions tactfully instead of taking a step back and being the actual unified commander. If we're talking about NIMS and ICS, there you go, Brian. Ultimately, I believe it was a tactical unit from Border Patrol with some sheriff's department personnel that came in and actually entered the room and stopped the threat. So that's the 2-minute summary of what actually happened. So there's been a lot of criticisms. It's been, I think it was 2022. So 3 years almost to the date. I think May 24th was the date. So almost 3 years to the date. And obviously the report that comes after it is a really hot topic, but now that this is back into the news, especially in Texas, this is all being brought back again. This bill specifically talks about the police training and response.
So I had a doctoral student just last week do like a crisis situational analysis of Uvalde, but I asked him to use, and you guys are familiar with this, I asked him to use the POP DOC loop, like at one point in time. So that initial response prior to the 77 minutes, if you applied like POP DOC, what could we learn from this? So, you know, what you said about that initial perception, this idea that it was a barricaded event or a barricaded subject, and actually the misperception even prior to that, when the truck was wrecked outside of the school, they thought it was a bailout. And so they didn't really respond to the wrecked truck in the way that they might have. So those misperceptions and how that then shifted some of the response, right? So it was really interesting to have him apply that framework, which I know that or the OTA framework can be really helpful for folks when they're in critical incident response. But they also talked about the lack of radio communication, the lack of key access, which I think drives the bill a little bit in terms of now having the devices to enter. They said they had a written active shooter plan in place directing the police chief to assume command, which he does, but then he really fails to perform. Well, he doesn't transfer the role over and no one else steps into the role either. So they have basically a scene incident commander who's not prepared. And I'm not sure if the bill does a lot about that. Yes, it encourages NIMS and it encourages ICS, but I don't know that it helps if you don't have the person in charge, the ability to transfer that role over. We can talk about that maybe more in a minute.
But
But
Usher wanting to jump in here. Let me
Oh,
do
I'm
this
sorry.
because you've hit now a critical mass of acronyms.
Just
So
look at that.
okay, I'm sorry.
no, it's all good. So let us
Yes.
just define.
Okay.
So NIMS is the National Incident Management System, ICS, the Incident Command System. And Dr. Murphy apparently is, as a new department head and just taking off in the world and taking over things, apparently is like reading some different level books. This is like the cone and the 3D cube thing.
Oh,
Like,
yeah,
I don't know what you're talking about. And now you're like Pop D27.
I thought
Please
it was a
educate us.
common term.
No, oh, worse.
I know.
I thought it was
She's
common knowledge. It's something we teach little children. You all would know.
It's-
Please
well,
She said,
educate
you
us.
guys know
Let's
this.
start
and then-
over.
Chris, do you know what she's talking about, Mr. Marine?
It's similar to the
There you go.
ODA
You
loop.
stumped the Marine on this. So you
Please,
got it.
please.
Teach us, Dr. Murphy.
Talking to the
I'm
Marine about not
sorry.
using acronyms, I'm like, wait,
And stamp.
What
It's
is
a-
all that?
It's
Yeah.
a framework similar to the ODA loop, which
ODA.
Brian, you train on that, and Chris, y'all train on
Yeah,
that.
it's
Um,
the
No, our listeners love this. It's really the authenticity, Chris, that we strive for. It's our ethos in many ways on the podcast.
Pop DOC says that like in that critical incident response decision-making moment, it's a loop, so you're doing this regularly throughout your crisis response. It says initially you have to go, you're perceiving what's occurring in the situation. So in this case, the perception of, hey, what's happening right now is it's a bailout, or which means somebody's jumping out of a car, likely and someone who's a criminal or maybe an illegal immigrant or something that is jumping out of the car, bailing out of the car and running from the police. So these initial perceptions of what was happening in the situation. The O is then you're orienting yourself.
Here's the code. So I'm showing everybody. Apparently,
Yeah.
the cube in the cube is related to the Pop DOC.
It is. It's from the same book.
All right.
So then you orient yourself within the situation. You're looking for patterns that are occurring so that you can begin to try to predict what's going to happen next. And so that your decision making is then informed by that. Then you decide, then can you operationalize that? So maybe they made some decisions here to enter the room, for example, but they didn't have the tools, the resources necessary to operationalize that. And then a big one that comes up here in this situation is around communication. Did they communicate the operationalization of those decisions out to all the different parties? And did they communicate even to parents? That comes up a lot in this bill. Sorry, I thought the Pop DOC loop was appropriate here for this discussion. But
No, it's appropriate. We just really didn't know what it was. So thank you.
So without bashing the police chief too much, there was a lot. He actually did have his radio on and left it in his car. So he was trying to communicate with his hand signals in his phone, but he did not take himself out of the tactical and make himself into the leadership. And that was probably his biggest fault. He was trying to be tactical and not be a leader. And you cannot be both. You cannot look at the 10,000 foot view if you're in the stack outside the door. You're making decisions based on that door and not the whole scene. I think if I was going to criticize, that would probably be my biggest criticism for him. And to your point with the Pop DOC or the OODA loop, when we're out there training, especially what I've done around the world in Libya and operations, is you should always take a moment every couple minutes to stop, to reevaluate. And actually, if you have a good mission, and this is not a mission that's planned because you're responding to an active shooter, but planned missions have those breaks in there for that exact reason, to take a step back and say, let's reevaluate this. What has changed? What are we doing now? They were looking for keys for so long, but it never said the door was actually locked.
Wow.
So this actual bill has money in there for officers to have breaching tools, but ultimately you really didn't need it if the door wasn't even locked and no one actually tried the door. There's a whole bunch of tactic stuff we could talk about. I don't want to get into that, but ultimately there was a lack of training. There was actually some subordinate officers that were saying, just go in. And he told them no. Yes, to your point, there was that reassessment. They kept saying barricaded. And it was like, that's a completely different scenario. Brian and I were talking this before we started recording. We went back to the pre-Columbine. That's what was taught pre-Columbine. We're going to wait it out and wait for SWAT to come in. But from Columbine to now, which is 30 years almost, we're now fading back. This event faded back to the pre-Columbine where we don't go in and stop the threat.
I mean,
And I think if anything, we need to take a step from this and learn that what we were doing in the middle 30 years was working to an extent, but ultimately it's still about response. This
I mean,
bill's about response and not prevention.
you
Yep.
can't be doing all of the things at once efficiently. And the core principle of unified command, incident command systems, and the National Incident Command System, NIMS, is modularity. And this is so wherever you're making those decisions, to be that leader who is being distracted. And we'll get to this, I'm sure. And there's a great sous chef, prep chef argument here that so many people have looked at Uvalde from the once the attack started rather than the, I'm going to describe it as dumpster fire, a ceramic thing here that I
Oh, hey, look at that.
you like that?
Ooh,
It's nice, right?
Very
A little dumpster fire.
Yeah.
That this case, and we wrote this up, we'll link it to some of the things we have at DPrep, but we wrote up, we played a game and said, let's imagine 2 weeks before Uvalde happened, we knew all the things that they knew. And Chris, to your points, 80% poverty rate in Uvalde, horrific problems. He had missed 170 days of school in that 1 year. Lots of problems, lots of needs for IEPs. I can't even teach this case in California. We sometimes teach cases where we take a fact pattern from a threat case and teach it. I can't even get past point one in California because they're like, why was no one intervening with this kid who wasn't showing up to school, who wasn't, it just was such a difference. No offense to Texas, Amy, but just a difference between how some different states approach these things. And I have been in states where there's been more of a focus on they're almost ready to graduate, they're not doing well. But California, I think, really struggled as I was teaching K-12 and threat with the idea of like, why would we not be engaging with this kid way earlier? Because he hit every single one of our risk factors, like every one that we had on Pathways and Dark Fox, and had no supportive factors. This was like Parkland in so much as we knew this was coming with all of the behaviors that were there. So it's interesting to look at the post or the hot wash on this, but it's also interesting to look at what could we have been doing beforehand. And once again, we're seeing, and Chris, we were chatting about this before on the call, we're seeing this problem of this over focus on ballistic shields and glass and how do we buy things to solve this problem when the problem really is behavioral threat management and BTAM principles.
Let me ask a question about that. Do you think that whole situation with what you just mentioned about focusing on ballistic shields and the equipment and the demilitarized MRAP trucks and stuff like that, did that cause part of this when we started just militarizing police forces and giving them this military grade equipment? Did it cause more of a, we're going to be totally tactical and not worry about that, not worry about it, but focus less on that? Is the door unlocked? Is there, what do we know about this kid and can we look into it? Yeah, thoughts on that? Sure.
As I was reading the executive summary from the after action, I was reading the bill, especially a section that talked about equipping them with their tactical breaching kits and armored vests and weapons and battering rams. I felt like it was the shooting that happened in LA with the bank robbery. And then all of a sudden, every police department in the United States had platform weapons and they looked militarized. And now 30 years later, we're trying to get away from that again. So where are we at? And I don't think this is militarizing our police because it's already there. But that section of tactful equipment, if I'm an officer, I'm not bringing my ballistic shield and I'm not bringing my battering ram kit and running into a building because it's going to slow me down.
Sure.
As somebody that's trained this and actually trained individuals overseas, trained individuals in the State Department, speed is our friend. Speed is a very good weapon. And all that stuff that they're talking about equipping them with is going to slow them down. Now, I'm not saying the units that are coming, we can't have it as a tool, but the responding element, I think, is going to slow it down. And to your point, sometimes overthinking it, I think that's what happened. I think they overthought it instead of just stopping the threat. And not, I'm not saying I would have done anything different because I wasn't there and I don't want to criticize the people that were there, but ultimately a decision had to be made. And that, I don't think that was the correct decision. Every officer has body armor. Your body armor is going to stop critical organs. So are we going to, a shield only works in certain areas. A shield does not work for a 2-person team. It really doesn't. When we get there, now we got to open our trunk and get our shields out. Now put our ballistic breaching tools on our back. And like you said, let's put RoboCop out there. Where are we going to stop with this? AI is taking over the world. We're going to have RoboCop in the next 30 years, but we have to stop the threat. The mission is to stop the threat.
The breaching tool requirement, it's really only 1 or 2 sentences in the bill. The bill has a lot of other requirements related to, I think one of the big ones is this idea that all of these responding law enforcement agencies and other agencies, they had never trained together. And we know no command post was ever established, but they had never trained together to know what the roles of the different responding units would be. So you see that highlighted in the bill as well, the requirement for on site within the school facility, training, having to determine who are all of the potential responding law enforcement units, and then needing to coordinate that. Did you notice that, Chris?
Yeah, I did. And I think you're going to see that in more rural areas than you will in the bigger cities or the municipalities that have a larger police department or have a bigger force, because you have so many, especially being close to the border now. You had Border Patrol that was literally right there, and they're the ones that really responded. You have the sheriffs, which is, I don't know how big the county is there, but I would imagine it's a pretty large county in Texas. Every county in Texas is large. Everything is big in Texas. It just says they need to train. And it doesn't specify that there needs to be training amongst each other to have that cohesion when an event happens. Maybe it's not a school shooting, maybe it's something else. So I think, but that's, once again, I think it goes back to leadership. That should be the police chief. That should be the AIC of the Border Patrol meeting to have that deconflicting of what are we going to do and when are we not going to do it? Who's in charge here? That's not a Border Patrol issue. I don't even know if they had authority to do what they did. They're federal law enforcement. Yes, they do. They have an authority to stop a threat. But was that discussed?
Yeah.
Now we have constables that are official, but they're volunteer. There's a lot of stuff that goes into constables as well. And who has control of these constables? So that is a very important thing, but it does not, if I read it correctly and I can read it through it again, it doesn't specify that those units need to coordinate.
I thought there was a section in there called complex response planning where they identify those law enforcement people, the requirement then to tabletop exercise and then in-person drill like every other year, which we could talk about alone.
Yeah, I didn't see that in there.
We're not, the problem is you're not seeing additional resources really coming along with this. There's some grant money, I think, as a part of it for local law enforcement. So when you think about Uvalde and you think about the limited resources, at least locally, to do the type of planning and the type of training that really is it's already required in a lot of ways for law enforcement in Texas. So does this do anything? Like, how do you actually give them the capacity to do these things and the resources to do these things?
In fairness to the former mayor, the congressman that put this bill forward, this is one of the first ones that I'm seeing that is requiring the police to meet with the school districts to coordinate active shooter response to schools. So to them, I think it's a start. I think it needs more meat to it. I think it needs a little bit more of the prevention. And they criticized the response. The response was 3 minutes. Stopping the threat was what we should be criticizing because they did not stop the threat. So I think the response is within average 3 to 5 minutes and nationally for police response, but I think it needs more meat. I looked at, I think the state legislation's HB3 that requires school safety. And I think they have a great website, the Texas, what is it? Texas
School Safety Center.
I think it's really good. I perused that. They got a lot of information on there, but it goes back to, I think it says municipalities have to meet with the school district. It doesn't say they need to go to individual schools. And I'm like, shouldn't we be going to the schools and having that meeting? Now, it does say that the school district's facilities need to have a threat and vulnerability and risk assessment done on the school. Is that including every school? It's very vague when you're talking about that.
I'm glad you brought up the threat and vulnerability risk assessment. So, because the schools have had that requirement, but it looks like this bill is talking about anytime new construction, anytime you acquire new buildings. I don't know, did that come up in Uvalde that there was a facility that maybe had recently been renovated or something? So the TVRA, the threat violence risk assessment, like it didn't look at those things. I thought that was interesting wording. It was specifically focused on renovations and new construction. So I thought maybe schools are missing that because they've always had the requirement to do like a safety and security audit and that includes their facility audits. So
I don't know enough about Texas State. I don't know what the requirement was before, but anytime you do have major construction and or renovations, it should be done. But this bill says every 3 years it has to be done.
Yeah.
So we recommend doing at least once a year for what we do, but they're saying every 3 years. And it doesn't say the police department has to be done. It has to be, there's some legislation in there, but I still think there needs to be more communications, not only with the other law enforcement entities, with the school districts, but also the individual schools. Because what I feel, they're going to have a meeting with the school district once a year, and we're going to check a box, and then we're good with this legislation.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
I feel like.
That's what a lot of compliance legislation becomes, right? It's clicking a box, and everybody thinks it's that whole thing about compliance is it's a floor, not a ceiling, right? That's a lot of people think that way. I did a little digging, and it turns out that a TVRA was done at Robb Elementary in Uvalde in 2022, which you may have all known that. And it found that the findings were not fully implemented or inadequately followed up on, which included door locks not consistently functional, entry points remaining insecure, done, but not a lot of follow up on it, which is how I fear a lot of these become. And I get if people can't follow up because of money, I get that. But again, we say all the time there's some low cost, no cost ways to make things safer. Yeah.
So Brian and Chris, you've both been out with doing threat and vulnerability risk assessments with me. I harp on the doors. Every door lock is different.
Yep.
I harp on that. And this just highlights what I talk about when I'm out there, and people are like, oh, the teachers have a lock. I'm like, okay, the teachers have a key. I'm like, but so it should be all the same. There should be a master lock. There should be so much if we're going to lock our doors, but ultimately it's the little things when I talk about it, and it seems like maybe a 1 or 2 liner in a threat vulnerability risk assessment. But in this case, I don't even think the door is locked. The guy was just in the room. The shooter was just in the room shooting. It's just one of the things that we're constantly looking at when we're doing these. And while we reread these and while we go back to, because we see the little things that some people don't see. And to your point, if that was done in 2022, this was May, of course they're not going to have all that implemented.
No.
We make a lot of recommendations that
Sure.
we know probably not going to be implemented.
Yes, you were able to get, I think, into the news story, which was nice and sometimes rare. We joked about having 17 minutes to prepare. You probably recorded 20 minutes. I think you had maybe a 30-second soundbite. And within that soundbite, you got in some conversations about preparedness and layered security. Can we talk about the layered security model that we're really narrowing in, which I think is appropriate? We do this all the time, and after actions and hot washes about how to ensure our communication is good, how we're chatting with each other, that we're on the same. We just did that program in Vegas on the radio repeaters and communications. That stuff is valid. If we were stopping school shootings and trying to address things, can you talk, or anyone really, just a little bit more about the preparedness, the before they're showing up, bad guy with a gun, what kind of things that we would put in place, and whether it's a behavioral threat or a layered security model again?
I'm going to defer to Chris and Amy on this to start, and then I can come back on the end for the response and the preparedness part from the law enforcement side.
Yeah, Brian, I think when you talk about the need for a layered security approach or layered safety approach for our schools, for our communities, here in the bill, we see some elements of that. So we see that the need to start with this overall TVRA or threat violence. I always get the term wrong. Threat vulnerability risk assessment, right? That we're looking at our facility, we're looking at our school overall to identify the threats, to identify those vulnerabilities. That's one initial starting point, that we have that then layered with a behavioral threat assessment approach. So here for this incident, that would mean that we have this awareness of an individual who's showing some concerning behavior, and we're monitoring, noting the level of risk associated with that individual, and we're intervening at an individual level. Now, I think for this scenario, it's an example of maybe this person really fell between some of our systems, right? He fell between, it wasn't really a school system's responsibility. It wasn't really the community system's responsibility. Like he fell between these systems. So there wasn't someone intervening. And then we see like emergency planning, that being another layer of what is required to have the safe school system. And so here in the bill, we see some requirements around things like a standard response protocol, so that there's training and preparation and a standard response for when an incident's occurring, that we all have similar terminology and similar language around lockdown or what would be some of the others, evacuate, right? That there's a standard response that we're trained on for really any hazard that occurs, and that would include active shooter events, and then going from there. So the need to not just focus on a hardened facility and not just focus on an individual intervention, that we need it to be layered, where we're focusing in all of these areas. That really creates the most bubbles of protection around our schools or our organizations. Does that help?
Yeah, no, I think it does for sure. However, we find an analogy that kind of looks at this, that we watch people having these fights and arguments about, we need this money, we need more guns, we need protection, we need hardened, bulletproof ballistic backpacks. And the less sexy part of it is talking about identifying kids on this pathway to violence and being in that space. So I think wherever it lands, it's a both and. And I wouldn't suggest that we throw out the utility of this bill. Like, I think any part of it can be useful. It's just, I think, to ground people in the idea that if we're really truly going to prevent violence, one of our major pushes and what we talk about is the idea of early intervention and preparedness. If you're going to have a big lunch rush or a breakfast rush, you got to have the prep done. Otherwise, you're going to get screwed.
Brian, maybe you could weigh in on a couple of concepts that are in the bill. So it's very recovery focused. So if we're thinking about that emergency preparedness model, it's definitely on the back end of response and recovery. And a couple of elements that are highlighted. One relates to crisis communication. And I know you talk about that a lot, but there's training in here for CIOs specifically, that there was just a real lack of communication out to parents and out certainly between agencies, but also out to those external parties. So a big focus here on crisis communication. And I don't know if there's anything you want to weigh in on related to that. It's not preventative, but it's an important part of preparedness.
Yeah, no, absolutely it is. And to this point, like, we just enlisted Chris Usher, who's jumping back and forth on and off the podcast. Lord knows what's going on with him in a minute.
Yeah.
But one of the things Usher is doing is we're revitalizing our SITREP program, which is looking at past after action reports. And some of this was his pulling this together. And yeah, Amy, to your point, looking at lessons where all the cars are parked on top of each other, does that then block emergency access by not having clear incident commander or an understanding of incident command? Or do they have a reunification plan? Or again, where people end up and where they're supposed to be directed? That preparedness throughout all of this. And we often use that Spy Games movie with Robert Redford talking to Gladys, and he's doing the burn bag, and he says, Gladys, when do we prepare for the rain? And it's before the flood. And that idea of preparedness is core to all of this. So it's, I think, if we're looking at this podcast, Chris, being some Terry Gross-esque fresh air extended without the 30-second time bump for typical PIO work where we can actually say what we mean and get it recorded.
Yeah.
It's a complicated answer, right? So there's not going to be a bill about let's identify at-risk kids and help them off the pathway to violence. That's not sexy. It's not easy to understand, and it's complicated. Buying everybody ballistic shields, improving radios, addressing repeaters. We see these things in all of these hot washes and after action reports, and they're valid. They are important things. But from our understanding of left of bang and right of bang, left of bang is before the explosion, right of bang is the stuff that we do in postvention and aftermath stuff. That stuff's important too. Stop the bleed, taking care of things. But if we're truly going to prevent the violence, we need to be thinking before we're getting to the point of active shooter person on the ground. And that's just, I think it's just important to ground in that space. But yeah, to your point, Amy, like crisis communication, the PIO, the public information officer, all of that's included in the nice overview for incident command. But all of us are struggling in these kind of moments with crises and protests and events. So it's to me, always a both and. How do we prepare beforehand, getting the skills we need to intervene and calm things down? And if everything goes kablooey, how do we have good stop the bleed aftercare and care for the people who've been the responders? Seeing these kids killed, seeing gruesomeness of this particular attack, many people go out. Even after Sandy Hook, I was able to talk to some of the coroners and people involved in the cleanup, and many of them left the field. That's how devastating it was. Caring for our folks who are doing this work is certainly an important space.
It is mentioned in the bill, mental health resources for first responders, critical incident stress debriefing, after action reporting is heavily focused on in the bill, like requirements for it within a certain time period. I'm not sure how you feel about some of those things, and maybe Chris Usher can weigh back in a minute. But Brian, I wanted to say this one more time because you talked about the need for behavioral threat assessment, the layered approach. The thing I'm really stuck on here is every school district in the state of Texas has to have a behavioral threat assessment team. It's already in legislation. It's already in law. Every single one of them has to do school safety audits, has to have an emergency action plan. So why it's already required? Where are we missing why is it not happening? Is it I'm sure it's a lack of resources, probably.
Unfunded mandate, absolutely. To Chris's point, Usher, you said this earlier, like, it's just not clear enough. Like, they say have a behavioral intervention team, and like, boom, now we got one. They're over there. They all meet once a month, and there's 5 people on it, and they do a bang up job. We look at that and we're like, oh no, that's horrible. There's 35 standards we should be looking at, and how are they dealing with all these things? So I think the lack of specificity, Usher, you had said this about the law, that it said something like having a training, but it doesn't say what training or how often or what it should focus on. So I think sometimes the law is a great first step to get people paying attention to the issue in terms of operationalizing it with some fidelity. That's where I think we run into some of those challenges. But it's better than nothing. Let's not, and I don't feel like we're doing this, but let's not beat up the law. Like, it's a movement in the right direction to get that conversation going, which is why I think it was important for Usher to be offering that interview, really to help. And I think you had a good conversation with the reporter. Everything didn't make it on air, but a lot of it was helping shape some of the media's understanding of this complex issue.
So I missed some of the stuff in there, but I think I got the gist of kind of what we're saying, and we're always on the same page. It's just, to my point on the interview on CBS Austin, and there is some preparedness in this bill, but I do think it heavily relies on the response. I do think this should have required the police departments to individually go to each school. I know that's a task. I know that's very difficult to do, but I felt like it didn't specify that enough. It just said the school districts, and we know what that means. To Brian's point about training, it does say required training, but what does that training entail? Are we going to do a 30-minute active shooter training? Workplace violence requires, and I've seen some great ones and I've seen some horrible ones. What does that entail? I'm not sure how much, Amy, did you get into the mental health? I know you mentioned it. It talks about the responders, but there's 4 pages talking about mental health, but nothing about mental health prior to the incident. I don't think I have not looked into the HB3, which is the school safety plans for Texas, but I don't know how much that has entailed the mental health side of it as well. I know it talks about BTAM and having a behavioral intervention team, but to Brian's point, what does that mean? I don't think it has enough meat. And unfortunately, being unanimously decided on, no one's taking enough time to put more meat into it.
Yeah, it situates implementation back out with predominantly 3 agencies here in the state. So our school systems are supported by educational service centers by region. Brian, you visited some here in the state and trained them on occasion. The Texas School Safety Center that you've mentioned out of Texas State, and the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training Center out of Texas State. They're the ones building the resources, but the implementation and how it's operationalized at the local level is just so inconsistent. And a lot of that comes from, you've got school principals, you have school counselors trained through a variety of different educational programs. The level of their capacity to do these things, it just really varies.
I've been on teams that go to embassies and audit. A lot of times that is, do you have an EOP? Yes. Check. Do you have a team? Yes. You don't actually sit down with the team. What do you guys talk about? Where's your training? Oh, we have training hours. Check. To your point, it's probably lack of oversight as well, to where we send in our EOP, we send in our comprehensive school safety plan for California. We send that in, but is anybody really going through that and seeing, hey, this person hasn't been in the school for 5 years, but they're still listed here, but we got a plan. Who's really going
Checklist compliance. Yeah.
Who's going through that and actually making sure this plan is working? It's the same people.
Thanks to Amy and Hollywood Chris Usher, and to, as always, to my co-host Brian. Happy to be here, and yeah, we'll see everybody later.